everyone, and welcome to episode 49 of What to Think, VentureBeat's weekly technology podcast. I'm Mark Sullivan.
And I'm Jordan Ovett.
And this week we're going to be talking to Rick Tetzeli, who, along with Brent Schlender, wrote the new biography, Becoming Steve Jobs. In the book, Tetzeli and Schlender try to show a Jobs that was warmer and more multidimensional than the previous half-genius, half-jerk narrative that we'd heard around the Jobs story. Tetzeli's unauthorized biography was actually blessed by Apple executives as a fair and accurate memory of Jobs, while the authorized biography by Walter Isaacson, called Steve Jobs, was heavily criticized by Apple executives, including Tim Cook and Johnny Ive. So we'll be talking about that later, but first, some tech news highlights from VentureBeat.com. Here are the three most popular stories from the site this week, and kicking it off is a story with a nice headline. It reads, "I'm pretty sure I hate Jay-Z's new music service." Yes, Jay-Z bought a music service, renamed it Tidal, and the first thing you notice about this, Jordan, is that the user interface of this new service looks a hell of a lot like Spotify's user interface. And Spotify was a little bit up in arms about that.
Have you been using it?
Week. No, I haven't tried it out yet. I can't say that I'm terribly excited to do so, just because it does look so much like Spotify, but I'm not going to pass judgment on it. I'll tell you, the selling point is that there's no free option here. It's either $9.99 or a $19.99 option for higher quality audio. And then the rub is that because of that, the artists get paid more.
Yeah, but think about the ownership of this newly talked about title. There's a bunch of pop stars. I think some people from Arcade Fire.
The event, yeah. I mean, Kanye West, Daft Punk, J. Cole, Rihanna, Madonna, Deadmau5,
right.
Jack White.
So my problem with this is how many independent artists are in this group. I would love to back a music streaming service that pays more money to independent artists, not these artists that already have enough money to pay their bills every month, probably.
Right.
And it's a nice idea to have higher quality sound. I'm not sure I would personally notice, but if I knew that there was more money going to the independent artists because of this high quality, then maybe I'd be more likely to start it and try it out.
That's an excellent point. And I don't see really indie artists here. We'll have to keep an eye on that and see how that works versus Spotify. The other story that went really well for us this week is about a memo that Bill Gates sent to Microsoft employees for Microsoft's 40th anniversary. The email, was slightly sentimental up front, but really talked more about where Microsoft is going and new products, really, like Cortana and Skype Translator and HoloLens. It was just an interesting thing, and it turns out a lot of people were interested in reading this.
I personally am glad that he named HoloLens. I looked at all the major announcements that Microsoft made in the past year, and I realized that the HoloLens is maybe the most significant corporate achievement for Microsoft in not only this past year, but several years. It's the first time Microsoft is really coming forward with the new concept that isn't a product that another company has released in a very similar format.
Yeah.
It's great. He is specifically citing that. I'm sure the Microsofties of the world were very interested to see which products he would cite as like, oh, you guys are doing really well.
Yeah.
And he chose HoloLens. It's a recognition that they're not dead. You can't write them off.
Yeah. They are a much more exciting company to cover than they were even a year ago, I think. I loved it that he made it the thrust of this note to talk about the future and the rebirth. So hopefully that spirit is alive and well up there in Washington, and that we'll be seeing a lot more interesting news like HoloLens in the future.
I'm also looking forward to trying out Cortana a lot.
Me too. Definitely.
Seeing how it compares with Google. I'm looking forward to playing with it and comparing it myself with Siri. And
I think there's going to be probably a lot of stories that do the Pepsi challenge with Cortana and Siri, where you ask both of them the same question and see what the answer comes out.
Is there a similar comparison when they've played Bing off of Google? Is there a name for that? I remember when it was happening.
I'm sure there must have been.
Well, I'm going to try this with the personal digital assistants. I'm looking forward to it.
It's going to be a great story. So the other story that we're tracking this week with great interest is HBO Now, which has just launched on iOS, Apple TV, and online. And this is HBO freeing itself from a cable subscription for the first time and offering its programming to cable cutters.
Cord cutters, do you mean?
Cord cutters, cable cutters.
Same thing?
Same thing.
Okay.
This news taken in and of itself is maybe not that huge, but it does point to a serious threat, I think, to the cable industry that they've been denying a long time. I mean, traditionally, I would have had to prove that I had a cable subscription to get HBO content in any form. Mm-hmm. And now I don't have to do that. There are already other people that are going to carry or are going to distribute HBO Now. And I expect other programmers or content owners to start selling video content in that way too. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch the fate of companies in the cable space. Could lead to a lot more consolidation like Comcast is doing.
Wow.
So
that tells me what you think. Is there any availability of HBO on smartwatches? Is that available yet?
I can see it coming. I mean, you better have pretty good glasses on if you want to see it on that tiny screen. But
tiny headphones.
I see no reason why you couldn't do that. So we've got that to look forward to. Apple Watch is going on pre-order this Friday, and also the new MacBook is launching this Friday. So that's about it for this week, however. And for all this and more tech news, you know where to go, and that's VentureBeat.com.
Oh, yeah.
The What to Think podcast is brought to you from the San Francisco headquarters of our host and sponsor, New Relic, which helps customers make sense of billions of data points about millions of applications in real time. More than 250,000 users leverage New Relic's comprehensive cloud-based solution to analyze more than 690 billion data points per day across more than 4 million application instances. When your brand and customer experience depend on the performance of modern software, New Relic provides powerful insight into your overall environment, from the web to native mobile apps and more. Learn more at newrelic.com. And now for the guest segment of our show. Today we have the privilege of talking to Rick Tetzeli, who, with Brent Schlender, is the co-author of the new biography, Becoming Steve Jobs. Rick is currently executive editor at Fast Company, which he joined in 2010. Prior to that, he worked for Time Inc., and from 2002 to 2009, he was managing editor of Entertainment Weekly. Rick came from Fortune, where he was deputy managing editor and the director of technology coverage. I believe, Rick, that's actually where you met Brent. Is that correct?
Yeah, Brent was Fortune's Silicon Valley correspondent, so I started out editing a bunch of his stories. We worked together for a long time and became friends, and always stayed in touch after I left Fortune.
Did you guys meet Jobs at about the same time, or was it different times?
Oh, it was totally different. I met Jobs twice. That's it. Once in a group setting at Fortune, and once with Brent at Jobs' little Palo Alto office that he had for a while. Brent met Jobs in 1987. He was covering him originally for the Wall Street Journal. He didn't really write about him until the debut of the Next Cube, and Brent had unique access all the way through. Jobs and Apple managed their PR very carefully.
As they still do.
Well, I think they're opening up a little bit, but, John Markoff, Stephen Levy, and Brent had sort of the most access to Jobs over those years of anybody.
I've been covering them for a couple of years, and I do think that it's not quite as tight as it used to be, and access isn't quite so tightly controlled.
I think it's part of a trend there, I mean, people always cite that thing about Jobs telling Cook, don't think about what I would do what you think is right. And that's carried over into personal and public relations affairs as well as product choices. I don't think Tim would have ever come out while Steve was still there. And the company, obviously, it didn't have a philanthropic program when Jobs was there. It wouldn't have supported LGBT causes. It wouldn't have spoken out on diversity issues in the same way.
Do you think Steve Jobs would have done more to make the data centers more energy efficient? I wonder if that's something that you think would have been on his agenda.
I have absolutely no idea. I mean,
okay.
It was so all about what's the mission and don't distract from the mission. And the mission was defined very, very sharply.
I think we're starting to get into the way many people approach this book. I'll tell you the way that I came at it is I've heard the normal narrative about Jobs for years and years, like everybody has, and, sort of the half genius, half jerk narrative. And so I came into this book really curious about what you two saw in him over the years. And maybe the main point of the book, and correct me, is Jobs was extremely controlling. I think people acknowledge that. But there was also this other guy there that was capable of learning and evolving his character over the years and maybe getting a little bit softer around the edges as time went on.
I find this also interesting because I agree, those are kind of the two things that are the broad trends, I guess, of the book. We set out to write a business book and to examine something that Brent believed, which is that Steve had changed more over the 25 years Brent knew him than any other executive he'd covered. We both felt that had not been reflected in previous coverage. There was something about that didn't strike either of us right. Like, if the Steve Jobs of his first tenure at Apple was brilliant only in spurts and burned people out left and right and was such a political neophyte that he got kicked out of the company he founded, then how could the person with those same qualities have succeeded so brilliantly when he returned to Apple? I just feel like that's something that hadn't been fully explained, and it wasn't something that Jobs was interested in explaining. He used to say, "I am who I am."
Yeah.
That's how we went in on it. As Brent's editor, I was also interested in, and Brent was interested in this too. It's like, what was that relationship really about? Like, Steve could be a jerk to Brent. On the other hand, he introduced him as his friend for years. He was going to work with him even after he had stopped working with him on Fortune articles. So exploring that relationship allowed us to start exploring Steve's relationships with the people who were close to him, largely people who were colleagues of his. Because that's another thing that has always seemed like something of a mystery to me. It's like, why did these folks work at Apple for so long if he was such a bastard?
Right.
I don't feel like that had been sufficiently explained. And as you guys know, money is not the answer.
Right.
Money matters, but it's not what drives people ultimately. There are all kinds of things that will cause an entrepreneur to start his fifth company after he's had 3 big hits, right?
Right.
So that's what we wanted to explore. And we started out exploring it with people who had been fired by Steve, who had left Apple because originally Apple didn't want to have anything to do with us.
It's so hard to believe. It was such a big brand. I think still has credibility.
I think so, but I think that we started this in the summer of 2012, about 9 months after Steve died. There was still a lot of emotional stuff. As an outsider, I was amazed when people started crying in our interviews and when people talked about him in the present tense. So there was an emotional component. Plus, the folks at Apple had cooperated with another book, and they thought they were done.
Turns out that book wasn't to their liking very much at the end.
Well, it wasn't to their liking. And when we did get Apple people on the record, we were very surprised that Tim Cook went on the record about his dislike for that book. We didn't intend this book as a corrective to that book. I went into this book assuming that Jobs is perhaps the most influential businessman of the last half century, and that there will be several books written about him, and that Brent had a unique perspective that we could explore together.
It was a very different perspective and a very different set of anecdotes and people that talked about Jobs. One of the things that comes up a lot is Jobs' ability to really fire up a team. And like you mentioned before, and talk to people that work for them, and they still say that they were very committed to him and very driven. But at the same time, you hear stories about how Jobs was willing to sort of play people against each other on his team, even later on when he was at Apple. And I'm making an observation that some of those more negative traits caused problems at Apple during the first round, but some of those things actually kind of persisted when he came back to Apple. Is that the way you see it?
I think that's totally fair. I mean, as we say in the book, all of us try to make the most of our strengths and diminish our weaknesses. And Steve certainly did not succeed at this entirely. I mean, read the emails from the collusion case or the, ebooks case. I mean, there are lots of perfectly credible stories about what a jerk he could be. There are stories on the other side, too. And what interested us was not trying to say he was a jerk or he wasn't a jerk, is trying to draw as good a portrait as we can of who he was. I think we show successfully in the book why he changed some of his traits as a businessman and what he learned. When business folks read the book, that's where they might find lessons, although I'm also so suspicious of shortcuts after working on this book. Why he was the person he was, what part his adoption had in it, what part his parents had in it. I mean, to a certain extent, that's speculation. On the personal side, we tried to focus in on the reasons for change that we could document. I mean, Brent saw him before he was married and saw him after he was married, saw him around his kids and saw the change that came about as a result of that, which is a change that comes to many of us.
Yeah. Rick, I just wonder if there are anecdotes that you guys discovered and could very well have written about, but chose not to in pursuit of a larger lesson for whatever audiences you were trying to reach.
One of the strange parts of working with Brent is that he'd known the guy for so long and had so many stories. So we had finished a draft and we were meeting with our publishers for the first time to talk about publicity. And Brent starts to tell this story about Neil Young. I'd never heard it before. And I'm sitting there looking at him like, why are you telling this? He wrote the book.
Was it about the records that Neil wanted to give Jobs?
Yeah. It was about the records. And so we went back and we put it back in,
Yeah.
He and Steve had so many conversations. It was a classic, effective journalist-source relationship, a long-term relationship where you do a lot of talking that's unrelated to stories behind the scenes and where both guys are trying to get information from the other. And we didn't put this in the book, but Jobs called Brent up to ask him if he knew any good female candidates for Apple's board. Brent gave him some, and Steve ignored them. Having written about business and edited business stories a lot, the thing that I came away really impressed by about Jobs and that I didn't understand about him going in was that he was so open to information from all over the place. And that's part of what enabled him to move into businesses like movies and music and telephony so well. He listened to everything. And it was all processed. And yet you saw none of that process. None of it. He was never reflective in that way. He would not tell you, oh, this is where that idea came from, and this is how I learned about that.
Right.
That's like a cautionary lesson for an era of instant news because it takes a lot of broad thinking to really make smart decisions. That's certainly what he did his second go-round.
That's where it really comes out, is when he has come back to Apple and sort of tries to stabilize the company, but they're still a computer company. And, then they have this idea, helped by Bill Gates, actually, to become, more of a consumer devices business. And that's a completely different business than where they were. And then you mentioned telephony, going into that whole thing. That's just a huge body of information to swallow.
I mean, I think people have done this to some extent, but it would be interesting to go back and compare the press before the iPhone and just see how it stands up against the press before the Apple Watch. I think that Apple has a great record of expanding into areas we didn't expect and giving us something we didn't expect that we then recognized we knew. I'm very skeptical about the Apple Watch.
Why is that? Do you think it has something to do with Steve Jobs' fingerprints not being on it as much as Tim Cook?
It's not at that level of detail. Apple convinced us all to give up our watches, and now it's trying to get us...
Right.
I associate watches with my grandfather. Like, it's not cool. I don't need it. But it'll be interesting. I am fully aware that in 2 years, I may well be happily wearing an Apple Watch.
I agree with you. I don't see many journalists out there that are jumping in and saying this is going to be a terrible flop. We're afraid to say that because we've, I remember you have something in the book from a journalist at the launch of the first iPhone saying a touch screen on a phone is a disastrous idea,
And the stores were supposed to be crap and the iPad sales were going to be slow. I mean, the most interesting thing for me in terms of reporting on Apple now is evaluating the many, many different areas they can go into. It's a very complicated thing for reporters because once upon a time we were accustomed to judging computers. Now we've become accustomed to judging devices. Now we're going to get into watches. We may get into wearables. We could get into cars. I mean, if you look at the fashion hires at the company, where's that going to lead?
Well, I think Google is doing similar things. It's not that surprising to see these tech giants almost battling with each other to show how much they're able to succeed as they enter new markets.
I think there's a feeling within wearables, and I'm sure Apple is aware of this, that the wearable is on the wrist right now, but it may begin to disappear into our clothing and different places on our body. And there's already the integration between that technology and the fashion world has already begun. And I don't know where that's going to go.
But you're going to criticize it. You're going to write the review. You're going to have to write about it. It's a really interesting movement. It's definitely true, Rick.
It's going to be really, really interesting. We had a great interview with Mark Andreessen talking about the iPhone and the amazing fact of bringing a mainframe into your hand. There's a certain way in which that ends a cycle of computing and of miniaturization and, how much smaller do we want it? Maybe we want it in our clothes. But it also upturns, the economics of computing to where the consumer market itself is what the military market used to be. It used to be that you had to build for the military and the technology would descend as it got cheaper.
Right.
Now the numbers in the consumer market are so big that you can chase the consumer market right from the beginning with the latest technology. So that old trickle down that we used to have, it doesn't exist anymore.
That's an excellent point. Addressable markets are huge. And, a lot of companies in the smartphone business sort of play a margins game, very broad distribution. And
look at the profit distribution.
Yeah, definitely. So there was one point in the book where he talked about this Fab Four concept. I was particularly interested in that because all the time I was reading this, I was really interested in this idea of collaboration and how well Jobs collaborated himself and how well he inspired it in others. Could you talk about that concept and what it meant to him?
As we know, he was very rough on his close executives, but he was also very close to them. They were all people who could yell back at him, who, as Susan Barnes told us, could listen through the yelling. So she would hear him yelling, she'd hang up on him, she'd call him back, he'd be quiet because she'd pushed back. There was nothing kumbaya-ish about it,
Yeah.
It was a community of people who understood, and this was really interesting to see it in people like Avi Tevanian and John Rubinstein who had left, and others, Fred Anderson who had left, people who assumed excellence in one another and who recognized their value as a team. And this is true for Jobs, too. He recognized that he couldn't do everything. And that was a big difference from when he had been at Apple the first go-round.
Yeah.
I mean, he told people, I can do anybody's job better than they can.
Yeah.
And when he came back, that wasn't true. He didn't go tell Fred Anderson how to manage the company finances. He didn't tell Tim Cook how to manage the inventory or develop the operations. He was intense about it and intelligent and asked good questions. In things like UI, he was all over it.
Yeah.
Brent was in a UI meeting once where, yes, he did actually lick the screen.
A UI so good you could lick it, right? Is that what he said? We need to kind of wrap up here, but I wanted to sort of zoom to the end of Steve's life. And I wanted to read you a quote that really kind of moved me from the book and said a lot. It says, "Heroic narratives aren't supposed to have chapters like this. In the typical Pixar movie or in the Disney animations that started getting better and better toward the end of Steve's life, true emotions are unfrozen, reconciliations are wholly achieved. But Steve's life wasn't a movie. It was inspiring, confounding, and unabashedly human to the very end."
Well, I'm glad you liked the line. We all want definitives, and I've never written a book before. And I found myself, in some ways, we were restraining ourselves towards the end because we didn't want to make leaps to things that we didn't know were true. Steve's life is not at all a great arc towards justice.
Yeah.
There were things at the end of his life that he could be really mean. He could be really tough. And, lest we forget, he was dying.
Yeah.
People in my family I know who have died have been quite difficult in their last couple of years, And sometimes we forget that. It's such an outstanding achievement, what he did, that sometimes we act as if, oh, this is this great life, this is this amazing man all the way through. You forget this human side that was there all the time. He didn't go into the office much at all in 2011. He had to really work himself up to get to that Cupertino City Council meeting. Mm-hmm. There's no question that he was a far more effective and brilliant businessman when he got back to Apple, and that he had done that by learning lessons. He had the internal humility to learn some lessons. He didn't show that externally, but internally he did. That all is true, but it's not one-sided.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to end. And Rick, I'd really like to thank you for talking to us about the book. I love the book, and I hope you guys write more books in the future.
Thank you so much. That's so nice to hear.
Okay.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks for joining us on What to Think, VentureBeat's technology news podcast. As always, you can find us online at venturebeat.com. And if you haven't subscribed to our podcast in iTunes yet, please do so. Just search for What to Think on iTunes.
And we're also on SoundCloud.
So that's it for this week. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.